Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm Alex Epstein. Well, I've been monologuing for probably the last 24 episodes, and I finally have another guest. I think it's the fourth guest in terms of absolute numbers of times that we've had a guest on the show, but it's the third guest in the sense of it is a repeat guest. So as I introduce the subject matter, if you're a longtime listener, you'll probably be able to guess who the guest is. So the topic I want to talk about today is overcoming the problems of social media today. Now, there are a lot of problems that people discuss in connection with social media. Though one of the big ones I want to focus on has to do with this issue that people, I think, mistakenly call censorship. But it has to do with the idea of suppressing certain people, suppressing certain ideas on different social media platforms. And there's a lot of controversy over this. And I think there are two kinds of positions that people take that I think are wrong. Now, the first position that I think is more wrong is that the government should dictate the content policy of different kinds of platforms. So they should say to Twitter, yes, you're big enough where you have to allow Donald Trump, and you shouldn't suppress anything that he says, and you shouldn't segment anything he says, or you shouldn't classify it in a certain way. And I think it's a wrong position for reasons we'll talk about a lot more. But then the second one, which many people who have my kinds of beliefs about free speech and the government shouldn't control these kinds of things, well, sometimes people go into, I think, well, there is no problem because it is their property. They can do whatever they want with it. And it kind of ends at that. And my belief is there are actually really big problems with the way that most of the platforms are handling the realm of ideas. And I think those are problems that we as citizens should be very concerned with. But I think rather than addressing them through government, there are two basic avenues, or at least two avenues to address them. One is for people interested in the issue who have ability to produce an alternative to try to produce a superior alternative. And then the other, which is related, is for better ideas about content policy. One point that people make that's right, I think, is it's not at all obvious how to do content policy on something like Twitter or YouTube. You can't just have, well, anyone can say anything they want. Like, it's not that easy to do. It leads to all sorts of challenges. And so today, if you've heard him before, you can surely guess what guest I'm having. It is going to be Brian Amerige. So Brian is my co-founder at our company, Thoughtful. And maybe even more relevant to today's topic, he was a long-time leader of different teams at Facebook, and he actually engaged very closely with these issues of content policy at Facebook. It's actually part of what led him to leave Facebook. And so he's thought about these issues in a way, both in a very principled way that's very aligned with the way I think about them in principle, but he's thought about them with a lot of inside knowledge and experience. So I think for me, he's the number one person in the world I go to when I want help thinking about these issues. And I happen to work with him pretty regularly. So he's willing to come on the show. And I'll just say at the end of the episode, as one thing you can do about this issue, in at least a certain element of it, we're going to invite you to our alternative, which is Thoughtful. But if you want to get started on that, the website is thoughtful.community/HFP. We're now letting some additional people on. It's still not totally open, but if you want to get on, if you like what you hear when we talk about Thoughtful at the end, go to thoughtful.community/HFP. So with that introduction, Brian, welcome back to the Human Flourishing Project.
Happy to be here.
All right. So I said a little bit about some of these issues, but I want to hear from you. So first, what do you think is the government's role in the content of different platforms like Twitter? Like, Twitter removes Donald Trump. They put different kinds of fact check things on people, or to give something that really annoys me, they'll take like a Joe Biden, in my view, sort of very ill-conceived energy policy, and they'll put it as like the top story under science. Like, I surely these platforms are doing things that irk all of us, and those of us who are more pro freedom probably irk more of us than normal. So what is the government's role in the content of these different platforms?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we need to separate between the legitimacy of criticism of these platforms, and there is a lot that's legitimately wrong about what they're doing in terms of content policy and moderation. And we need to separate between that and what the government should actually do about it. And in my view, the government's job is to protect each of our right to free speech. And the issues that we're talking about here are not free speech issues. Free speech doesn't mean that everybody has a right to speak everywhere. It means the government can't stop you from speaking. There's another element of this too, which is not talked about very frequently, which is that if the government were to step in and tell Twitter or Facebook, you have to give a platform to this or that person, or you have to give a platform to these views, that's a violation of Twitter's right to free speech. An aspect of the right to free speech is the right not to speak. It's an aspect of the right to free speech is the right not to give, not to promote views you don't want to promote. And so the actual only violation of free speech that would be happening in this sort of scenario these days is if the government stepped in and told Twitter, no, you have to treat the two parties equally. You have to give voice to these people, even if you don't want to give voice to them. That would be the only thing that we're seeing here that would actually be a violation of the right to free speech. Now, another aspect of this though is that people talk about, particularly people on the right and in the present moment, talk about, well, these platforms are just so big, they're so influential, they've become, de facto public squares. And if they're public squares, then, you have a right to speak on them. And honestly, I don't think that's a particularly serious argument. Every public square that existed 15 years ago still exists today. The idea that, what Twitter and Facebook have done is they've created private squares that are just so much more compelling and so much more valuable than anything that existed before them, that now it's just hard to imagine not using them. But that doesn't give us a right to use them. I mean, no one's taken away the public squares. What these companies have done is create private squares that are just more attractive than everything else. But that doesn't give us a right to use them. And so, I mean, that's the basic framing of the issue. There's very little the government should be doing here, other than arguably reassuring Twitter and Facebook that no, contrary to what people are pushing us to do, rest easy. We're not going to interfere with you. We're not going to force you to do this or that. And they do, I think, have a responsibility to say something like that, because very legitimately, these companies do feel implicit or explicit pressure from Congress, from the politicians in DC to do something, because they're being asked to do something. And very legitimately, they can be afraid that if they don't do something, whether, for example, the incoming Biden administration, I think there's a legitimate chance that Twitter probably removed Donald Trump in anticipation of that relieving some of the pressure, the political pressure from the incoming Biden administration. And that's exactly the kind of thing that the government should be going out of its way to say, no, you don't have to do that. Our job here is to protect your right to free speech, your right to your property, to run as you see fit. And we're not going to interfere here, regardless of who is asking us to do X, Y, or Z.
I mean, one thing that I've noticed with the climate catastrophe movement that I talk about is they certainly were at least trying to put a lot of pressure on Facebook in terms of a lot of the fact checking stuff. And maybe you have an insider's view on what happened, but I mean, definitely it was saying, hey, you Facebook are this public entity. We need you to crack down more on anyone who questions climate catastrophe. And if you don't do it, then we've got some potential laws and maybe even an antitrust suit up our sleeve.
I mean, antitrust in particular is always and I know this directly at Facebook, it is always the looming threat that these companies are thinking about. And part of, that's sort of a whole conversation on its own for why that is. But, antitrust is a looming threat because it's really so subjective from the point of view of the government. I mean, you can bring antitrust action if you're if you've priced something too high, if you price something too low, it's pretty much no matter what you do, there is some way the government can frame what you're doing, whether you're successful or not, as worthy of antitrust action. And so it's sort of this blank check in a way that government has to control some of these companies, and it's very hard to actually trace what's motivated what or what people are afraid of. But it's thinking of it as a looming threat is I think the right way to hold it. The other thing I do want to just say about government's role here, and some of the claims from folks that are pushing for, put aside the First Amendment issues. Some of the more nuanced asks from particularly conservatives are looking at something like Section 230 and saying like, oh well, maybe we ought to either get rid of this or we ought to amend it to require something like neutrality. And again, like I have the same basic reaction to that, which is I don't think that people who are asking for this are really thinking through what the consequences of something like that would be. And I could take both of those, like, just Section 230 is essentially
is that of the Communications Decency Act, or is that
yeah,
is that what it
yeah.
is?
I believe that's what it's a part of.
Is it the 1996 law or something?
It's from around then. I believe that's the broader piece of legislation that it's from, but it essentially immunizes internet companies from being responsible for the content that their users post. And if prior to its existence, in a platform like Facebook or Twitter or even Netflix or Google would be liable for the legality of the content that's posted on their services, which essentially means all user generated content is just completely untenable. And so one way the correct way to think about this is Section 230 is the law that made the internet as we know it possible today. This is not something that just immunizes companies like Twitter and Facebook. This is the law that made Netflix, Google, Yelp, LinkedIn, and Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Like, it's pretty much the internet as you know it is only made legally possible, legally scalable, because of this immunity. And if you take it away, those companies are just they're dead. I mean, there's not much more to it than that. There's the liability and the scale of the legal teams that they would need to deal with this sort of thing is unthinkable. And so that part is just honestly a joke when people talk about getting rid of Section 230. That's not a gift that these companies have been given. It's the legal basis on which the internet was built. And so, that's a huge point. But then, some more nuanced folks are saying things like, okay, well, what if you just made that immunity dependent on them being neutral or them treating everybody equally? And this is, again, you're talking about neutrality, like according to who? The government? By what standard? Political bias? Talk about a destructive idea. The last thing you want to do is put government in a place where it's deciding what is and isn't politically biased or what is and isn't neutral. And not to mention, the truth is not neutral. Neutrality is what makes the kind of platform that you and I are building, a platform that promotes more thoughtful content, possible. A requirement for supposed neutrality forces every platform to become a cesspool where conspiracy theories and things like critical race theory rise to the top and by law have to be treated equally alongside the most rigorously thoughtful content on earth, which is, if you want to shoot every possible improvement over the status quo that Twitter and Facebook have, today in the foot, enforcing neutrality as seen by the eyes of Congress is probably the best way to do it that I've seen. So, it's just, again, it's like if you spend 5 minutes thinking through a lot of these suggestions, they're really just not very practical or principled, for that matter.
All right, so let's talk about what content policy should be. And I'll say something, I don't know to what extent you agree with it. I think there is, so there's something to, in college, they talked about often somewhat disingenuously about a marketplace of ideas. You want to be in a place where you can have open discussion, where you're exposed to different views, where it's not, people aren't just in bubbles. And I do think that people had this impression of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And maybe those, I don't know if those platforms gave it, but I think to some extent they did, where it's just, hey, this is a place where you can connect with people and share ideas. And it's this kind of open thing. And then you start to see, oh, wait, no, they really have an agenda, or they really have a viewpoint. So certainly with YouTube, there was this example where I can't pronounce her last name, but the CEO of YouTube said, anything that goes against World Health Organization guidelines doesn't belong on YouTube. And then if you look at even those guidelines, it's like, okay, that is, you really question that as a standard, because they just keep changing their views on everything, like on masks and on different kinds of fatality rates and stuff like that, and contradicting. So what view? So it's just that kind of thing. Like there's something very off about that. And even an example, this muddies it slightly, but it's one of these more borderline examples. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., whom I am no fan of, I debated him on energy issues, and I did not find him to be the most thoughtful person, to say the least, about those issues. But he posted something on vaccines, and critical of vaccines and his views of coronavirus, which I'm sure are at least 99% distortions, whatever he wrote. But I have noticed that with I found myself, I'm actually curious what he says. Like I wanted to find what he posted, because I like to see these different views, and I like to see, hey, is there a grain of truth? And in that case in particular, what I've noticed with the vaccine discussions is there's this polarization between people who are, I don't know if they're against all vaccines, but there's just this hostility toward vaccines that only focus on and dramatically overstate side effects and ignore just the unbelievable benefits of vaccines. But on the other hand, there are just people who say like, oh, this vaccine has been proven safe, end of story. And I read something recently on Thoughtful, not surprisingly, where I need to share it, but on Thoughtful, but like, oh, there was this writer in Sweden. He actually went through all the studies and like gave a really good assessment. And he was talking about like really honestly, hey, I would take this vaccine, but I wouldn't take this vaccine. It's really nuanced. And this is kind of a long-winded way of getting into this, but it's like, I want a world where his view can be there, and Robert F. Kennedy can be there, and others can be there, and like I can really choose. And maybe I have different filtering mechanisms and stuff. But this kind of marketplace ideas, there is something really legitimate there. So what that leads into, what kinds of content policies could exist that would have this marketplace of ideas, but that wouldn't just be a cesspool and wouldn't just allow, well, crime for that matter. So that's way too rambling a question, but you've thought about this, so you'll give a more straightforward answer than my question.
I mean, this is I love this question in a way, because it gets at one of the most underappreciated aspects of these platforms as both products and as businesses. Now, I mean, it's not true that there is some golden content policy out there that is just sort of, as if the founding fathers of the United States wrote it themselves or something like that, that you could apply to Twitter, to Facebook, to YouTube, to all these platforms, and that that life would just go on happily and everything would be wonderful. That's not how this works. And the reality is the content policy needs to depend on the product and the goals of the people who make it. You have to solve this problem at the right level. Like content policies themselves they exist to solve problems and establish, sort of extreme goalposts in a way, or fences, to solve specific problems that occur in specific products for specific reasons. And so when you talk about a platform like Facebook, and again, this is coming from, I'm one of the most outspoken critics of where Facebook and Twitter have landed on these issues. But you can't arrive there by underappreciating the complexity of the problem. A platform like Facebook that promotes content based on its likelihood to stimulate you, whose goal is really about bringing people together. It's important not to forget that. Their goal is about bringing people together. It used to be about giving people the power to share. That became bringing people together, and that's worth noting. But that's a different problem to solve in terms of a content policy versus a platform that, for example, managed to identify and promote more thoughtful content and seeks to enrich your mind. Those are wildly different products with wildly different goals, and they will have wildly different content policies. And again, I'm not defending how Facebook has done given their product, but I do think that they deserve more credit than they often get from their critics. In Facebook's case, there's a very good reason they don't just make it to use a straw man. There's a very good reason they don't make it a free for all, and that's because it would become a cesspool of conspiracy theories and clickbait and sensationalism, because the product optimizes for what's interesting. And what's going to get people to engage, and that's a good mechanism. That ranking mechanism is good when the purpose of your product is to bring people closer together, and it's to help people share more about their lives. And if you think about the kind of the kind of core content that Facebook started around, which is friend content, it's content from your friends about how their lives are going, about what they're up to, about major decisions they're making. What's interesting is the right metric to optimize for that kind of content. But you apply that same standard, that same ranking to something like ideas, and you do get conspiracy theories and clickbait and junk. And so, we have to keep that in mind when we're judging these companies. Facebook is not created to be a marketplace of ideas, despite the fact that they sort of view themselves and talk about themselves very publicly in incredibly broad terms. And I think they would like to be the world's marketplace of ideas, but they're not exclusively for that. They don't care more about that than they do about people sharing major life events. And you've got to understand that from the perspective of their content policy. Now, so that's sort of a long-winded answer, but it's almost the beginning of the key bit here, which is that what that all really goes to say is that Facebook as a product, as a business, isn't a very good platform for ideas, not because of its content policy, but because of what the product is. It's a central place for everyone that incentivizes engagement and connectedness, not thoughtfulness. And the fact that the content policy has ended up being intellectually toxic, which I think it is a secondary consequence of this. It's not the primary. And that's why I'm not still working at Facebook, arguing about their content policy. It took me 7 years to sort of come to that conclusion that there's a lot wrong with their content policy. But the fundamental reason that they are not a terrific platform for ideas, the kind of thing that we I think all imagined our university experience would be like, is not even if you get the content policy right, it's not solving the problem at the right level. The problem is, as a product, that's not what Facebook was conceived of being. It's not what the people, particularly at the very highest leadership levels of Facebook, are most passionate and interested in. It's not the goal or mission of the company. And that's the real fundamental starting point for why you're not going to get them to be a great platform for ideas. And so that's why I eventually left, because that's what I care about. That's what I came there for. That's what I think is the most passionate, I'm most passionate about and most excited about bringing to fruition on the internet. But it's different than what Facebook is. I think it's also different than what Twitter is. It's different than what YouTube is.
I think Twitter is an interesting example because it's got its whole interesting little format, but it could, I think, more plausibly be interpreted as, hey, this is a place where different people, share their ideas on what's happening in the world. And it gives you the mechanism to follow people that you find interesting and sort of to ignore people that you don't find interesting. And so it does seem like, I'm curious if you had like a vision of, okay, what would because you could just say, well, okay, but Twitter's not really interested in that. Like they're they're interested in, I mean, I think it's something like, uh, what is it? I was in a room once with Jack Dorsey like years ago, and I asked him, and I just remember his kind of emphasis, and I think it's the same publicly, is, like, you let you know what's happening right now. Like what is the
Mm-hmm.
most important thing happening right now? But then part of that is, well, we think like, you need to know, but like based on in some ways, based on our view of what's important to advancing our narrative uh, of the world. It's like, okay, well, it's really important in the realm of science for you to know
Yeah.
that Joe Biden claims that he's going to create all these green jobs to replace people who are in the oil and gas industry. So like that's so what I guess what do you think is going on with their ideas? But then I'm interested in, okay, if they were actually, I could see this kind of thing as against Facebook being like more of a marketplace of ideas. Well, I'm curious what kind of content policy you would propose if it were trying to be a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I think I just want to emphasize like what you said that Jack said about what Twitter was really all about and what they've said publicly about being, here's what's happening in the world today. It's so important to not overlook how far reaching the consequences of him as CEO and the company, I think culturally having internalized that as a mission is. I mean, because again, that's the starting point. If you're starting from, then this is why you have things like 280 characters or originally 140 characters. That's the right product decision from the perspective of very we're not trying to be deep, we're not trying to be necessarily even right that's not like the primary thing. The primary thing is just awareness of what's going on. It's a lot about velocity, it's a lot about volume, um, and you get that in the product. I mean, and you just have to grapple with the fact that because these companies care about things from that perspective, there is a limit to how far they're going to go. And again, I can't even answer the question of what would a version of Twitter that cared about a marketplace of ideas the way I do, what would they do? The answer is they wouldn't be Twitter. The product wouldn't be Twitter. The product of Twitter is a consequence of the fact that they have a particular view of what they're doing, and what they're doing is more about the awareness of what's going on in the world and less about helping people figure out what's true, and serving up content that's going to enrich your mind and your life. They're wildly different goals. And I mean, I think it's maybe some folks won't believe me when I say this, but the answer is like, if you really cared about a marketplace of ideas, if you really wanted something that every time you opened it, you got something that was going to make enrich your mind, you'd build something like Thoughtful, and I think it would look a lot like Thoughtful. It would look nothing like Twitter. Twitter is not made for that, and it never will be. And that's part of the futility of anybody who's advocating for the government to step in and do this. Is like, I've seen from the inside at Facebook, it doesn't matter how big the guns you point at these companies, they're never going to be good at this. They don't get it. They do not think from a perspective of how do we help people figure out what's true. And again, I have an enormous depth of respect for the talent at these companies for their respective missions. But the sad truth of it is, the state of epistemological understanding at these companies, their views on how do people acquire knowledge, how do people figure out what's true, they're kindergarten level. They really are. I mean, they have not thought deeply about those kinds of questions. And it doesn't matter how big the gun you point at them is. It's not going to make them become world class at answering those questions. I mean, the skills just aren't there. The passion isn't there. It's not what the companies are. And that's exactly, I mean, this is why it's so important that the market is left free and open to let people who do have I think a stronger perspective and more passion for those issues actually work on them. So, I mean, I know I didn't really answer your question, but I don't think you can answer that question.
Yeah, you keep pushing back on my and maybe it's just the wrong desire, because and maybe part of what's going on is just there's this false, it reminds me sort of a Garden of Eden type thing where it's just like this false,
Mhm.
vague idea of this open marketplace of ideas, but it's not really thought through, and it's not thought through what the purpose is and what it would actually look like. Because I'm kind of asking, like, okay, how do we move toward that idea? Or it's interesting when we'll talk about thoughtful in a minute, but like when we think of
Yeah.
thoughtful, we're thinking about, we're not thinking about that interest. We're not just thinking, oh, we want to create a marketplace for no
Yeah.
particular purpose. We're thinking about things like, we want to help people spend more time on on content that enriches their life versus wastes their life. That's one aspect. Or
Yeah.
we want to help people, figure out what's true on things. And so then that has implications for what ideas we put in front of people. Do we put in ideas in front of people? What determines that? It's definitely not just everybody who gets an account can shout at you equally. So do you think it's that part of what's going on is I've adopted this vague uh, fantasy?
I mean, at least with regard to asking, like, what would if I were the CEO of Twitter or the CEO of Facebook, like, what would I do to make these things fantastic marketplaces for ideas or anything like that? Yes. I mean, that's what you'd have to do is tear them down and rebuild the product in accordance with a mission that was actually interested in those things. And the products would look wildly, wildly different. This is sort of this is the part of me that thinks like somebody in Apple's orbit, that like these products are whole things. They're all integrated single pieces, and you can't just sort of rip out the content policy, plug in another one, and think it's going to work. They all sort of work. They all sort of work together. They're consequences of each other. Um, yeah, I mean, it's the yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. I mean, there's a lot I could say about, you know, from a starting position. How do you start from the the point of view of like actually competing with these companies? Like, what would it be to legitimately?
Well, I wanted
Um,
to ask about, maybe we can, I just one topic I want to cover before thoughtful is I wanted
yeah,
to ask about, I was thinking of it as like your broad guidance for alternatives that were trying to be more of a marketplace of ideas. And so there's Parler,
yeah,
which last time I checked is shut down. And then there's Gab, which is
uh-huh.
interesting too. And I'm curious, any guidance you have. And I'm also, we've talked on our own about some of the technical things, which I
Yep,
found fascinating. So I hope you mentioned those, just in terms of what you should think about and why you shouldn't make yourself in a position where
yeah,
AWS can just totally gut you if
yeah.
they don't like you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start this with like part of what I learned in my time at Facebook is what not to do when you're trying to compete with these platforms. Because I was, I had the privilege of having a front row seat to the many startups and platforms that did try to compete with Facebook, and watching them get decimated for many of the same reasons was pretty formative for me, and it taught me a lot. So this is coming from that perspective, and um, it's part of why I think people underappreciate how difficult the problem uh, is of building a platform. So one really fundamental thing is that you we when it comes to alternatives, we need to actually solve the roots of problems. You can't just copy Facebook and remove the content policy. You can't just copy Twitter and remove the content policy. The value that people are getting from these things needs to be for them to sustain, and not just be like peaking because Donald Trump gets banned from Twitter. For them to actually sustain themselves as legitimate alternatives. The value people get from these new products has to be 10 times better than what they could be getting from the sort of general services that something like Facebook or Twitter offers. And so entrepreneurs who are working this, they need to be asking themselves, what's not possible because of these crappy content policies? So it needs to be framed as a positive, not a negative. Otherwise you end up in this situation where I think Parler and Gab and others are finding themselves now, where if you define yourself essentially as, oh, we're a free speech version of Twitter, you end up attracting only the people who are not able to use Twitter. or Facebook anymore. And, some of those are fine people, but a lot of them are not. I mean, that's not the base community that you want to start with, is just the sort of rejects from these major platforms. And so it's the lesson number one there is to focus on the positive, not just of being a variation of the dominant platforms out there, because realistically, you don't get to the kind of scale these platforms are at by being a variation. You've got to be something totally new. You've got to actually solve a real problem people have, not just sort of a political, ideological, wart, if you will, with the existing platforms. So that's number one. I mean, number two in here would be, and this is the reason that most of the platforms I've seen have failed. It's the easiest thing in the world to come up with an idea for a platform that's amazing if you had 100 million people on it, but is completely useless when you have 10 people on it. And the reason this is so important is that you start with 10 people. You don't start with 100 million people. So if what you're working on only works at scale, you don't have anything yet. You don't have something that works. And so the art of this, in a way, is solving a problem that really, really matters. And you can doing it 10 times better than anyone else can do it, including Facebook and Twitter, but doing that in a way that works when there are 10 people. And that gets better and allows you to solve even broader problems when there are 100 million people, if there are 100 million people. But you can't have that as a dependency that you got to operate at that scale. And so that's just sort of at the high end, product side of this. Where we start to see some of the issues that have become something of a joke, if you ask me, with Parler, for example, is that when you're small, you can't have independent infrastructure. And what that means is if the whole point of your new platform is to give a home for content that isn't welcome, or is because it's, for example, controversial to a lot of people on the major platforms, what you're signing up for is to basically exclusively host controversial content. And you can see this coming 10 miles away if you're thinking, seriously about it, that if that's what you're doing, you better have the independence and infrastructure across the whole stack for you to support controversy. And the reality is that is an unbelievably technically complex and expensive thing to do. And this is what Parler has run into. I mean, the idea that you're just going to sort of copy Twitter's product, remove the content policy, and put it on top of Amazon's services to host it. And Amazon is, what they're going to do is predictably enforce their terms of service, which is going to have deference to their view of what's controversial. You could see it coming 10 miles away that's not going to work. And that's exactly what happened to them. And it, part of it actually makes me it kind of annoys me in a way, because it delegitimizes the idea that you can actually compete with these platforms. Because, to be very honest with you, I think it's a bit of a joke. It's a bit of a joke that you would knowingly build a product and a business around essentially hot, controversial content, but then not go do the work of actually having independent infrastructure that can support controversy. I mean, anybody who's thinking for 15 minutes about these things can see that coming. And I, my purpose here is not to dish on these platforms, but I don't appreciate playing the victim card on these things when they are pretty damn obvious issues for people who do take the idea of alternative platforms seriously, and I do. Sorry, I guess that was a bit of a rant there. I will say, in all fairness, Gab has actually done quite a bit better than Parler in terms of the independence of their infrastructure. And to give you a sense of what that means, they don't take credit cards. They can't. In order for you to subscribe to Gab, you've got to send them a check. You've got to use Bitcoin. It's incredibly inconvenient. But they've at least been principled enough to build with the assumption that they're going to have independent infrastructure, and they've done the legwork in order to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that they've done any better in terms of actually On the product side, I mean, they're kind of an even more extreme version of just sort of copy the basic fundamental idea of a social network, literally remove the content policy for all intents and purposes, and just sort of let's see what happens. I don't think that that's a meaningful product. It's not sort of a meaningful alternative to uh, it doesn't produce a platform of ideas for very obvious reasons. It produces a cesspool is what it produces. And so, I don't view that as a particularly serious alternative, if you will, but at least I do have a little bit more technical and strategic respect for what they've done, because they did take the problem of the independence of their infrastructure seriously. At least they've done that.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see. The thing that I found, I told you about what I found a turn off was just that the founder was so overtly outspoken about his own views, which are, very, I would say, religious fundamentalist views.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
like, this is all, we're on a mission, a specific mission for a specific religion. And it just doesn't strike me as, oh, this is conducive to, like, you imagine, like the dean of your school was that way. I think you
Right.
wouldn't feel like, oh, this is a platform of ideas where I can express to you. Think like, oh, well, what if I say an atheistic idea? What's going to
Right.
happen on this? And is it like, is his mission going to, like, what if I'm persuasive? What if people with atheistic ideas are persuasive? Like, is he still going to think it's some? So it just strikes me as, and with thoughtful, which we're going to talk about now, like, we've thought a lot about, as the creators of it, how are we positioned? I mean, particularly as we both are people with controversial ideas, like how do our ideas affect what goes on thoughtful? How do we
Mhm.
communicate that? I mean, we're very, I think, we do a lot of things to make sure that we don't dictate, that everyone is clear, like, hey, you can share what you want on this. It's not what Brian and Alex
Mhm.
likes, and we have to talk about the details to get more into that. So let's talk about thoughtful for uh, 10 minutes or so. And I think the issue of purpose is really relevant. I think when people have heard, hey, we're working on something that's an alternative, they
Yeah.
definitely put it into, oh, now we're going to have our ultimate marketplace of, like, we're going to have something that's going to have 4 billion users. It's going to be a marketplace of ideas, and it's going to be a paradise for conservatives, and they never have to worry about it. It's just interesting that that's like always the thought. It's always like, oh, it's going to be
Yeah.
like the others, except the parts that we don't like. And so
Yeah.
I mean, thoughtful will evolve over time, but like, let's talk about the purpose of thoughtful and how that
Yeah.
makes it very different than people often expect.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just set the context here before I get into the product. Like, part of why a platform for ideas matters, and this is not going to be a surprise to listeners of this show, but part of why a platform for ideas matters is to give us access to the knowledge we need to flourish. I mean, and the internet is a paradox today in that regard. We have access to so much amazing content. The best stuff that's ever been produced is just at our fingertips on the internet, but it's competing with 1,000 times as much junk. The clickbait, the new, whether it's clickbait and sensationalism are one thing, but news that doesn't really matter, and we don't know whether it's true. Even news that does matter, but that isn't a good use of your time to focus on, which is such a huge category. We're suffering from endless scrolling feeds of content that's interesting, but in the aggregate, not very good for us. And I played a part in making some of that possible at Facebook. So I've spent a good deal of time thinking about that problem and the psychology of it. And so that's why, it's why you see that, things like digital detox and, Apple did screen time. And there's just this sort of general culture that's setting us against our phones. And, with thoughtful, what we see is an opportunity to transform that relationship, to build a new kind of habitual content consumption experience that's actually good for your mind. That focuses on and incentivizes enriching content, not junk. That helps you get through long form content, even in 5-minute sessions, which is something that the internet and platforms today are just terrible at. There's a huge bias toward short form content, toward things that are recent. because again, we want to build around the reality that most of the best content in the world was not produced today, let alone this week. And so, this is part of the whole context we're building for, and that's what Thoughtful's all about. It's a platform for finding, sharing, and enjoying enriching content like podcasts, like videos, books, and articles, the stuff that you mean to get to, but we all, I think, struggle not to actually get to. And it's just the beginning. We've got so much work to do on the product, and huge plans for where it leads. But so far, what we've built is an amazing place to spend time, and it's remarkable how transformative it is to turn screen time from a guilt trip into something that you're proud of for very obvious reasons.
Yeah. So just a couple of how I see it and experience it. And I think of Thoughtful as this is the one place on the internet that's exclusively devoted to thoughtful content. So this is content that enriches your life, not wastes your life. And there are a couple mechanisms for getting content on Thoughtful. So one is you can pull in the best content from around the web that exists, and you can pull that into this thoughtful place. So you can now, this wasn't true last time we talked about Thoughtful, but you can follow podcasts, you can follow YouTube channels. And interestingly, Brian, I didn't tell you about this, but on Cal Newport's podcast the other day, which I follow on Thoughtful, not on the train wreck that is Apple Podcast, let alone the disaster that is being on YouTube. Like, there was one explicit question where someone said, how do I get the benefit of YouTube without rabbit holes? So it's almost exactly like, oh, just follow on Thoughtful is the exact.
Yeah.
I gotta email him about that.
Yeah, we should invite him,
because it's just so. Yeah, we'll invite him at some point too. But so that's just one example where, and in the future we'll probably have other forms of content. So any individual piece of content that you think is interesting, like it doesn't go, you don't need to put it in Apple Notes, you don't need to put it in like your inbox. You can just pull that into Thoughtful, but you can also subscribe to or follow things. So that just, even independent of the other people on Thoughtful, it's just this amazing single place where then you can go and everything there is good. And that's just a totally different experience and you can go anytime and just, you have some downtime and you just go to Thoughtful. It's like, oh my gosh, there's this new stuff. And then on top of that, so you're pulling in the best, sort of the best stuff from around the web that you know of. But then Thoughtful itself is all about, it is additionally about sharing what you think is the most thoughtful content with other people. And the way it works is on Thoughtful, our main content policy is we give you content from other people in the Thoughtful community that you choose to follow, or that are part of or that are people that they follow. So if you choose to follow me on Thoughtful, like, you're not going to see anything from me on Thoughtful unless you choose to follow me or you choose to follow somebody who follows me. Like, that's basically the way that it works. But as a result of that, you can find people that you think are thoughtful, and then the quality you get from them is going to be almost as if you ask them, hey, Brian, what are your best recommendations ever? And we found that's part of the secret sauce of Thoughtful, where people tend to have all of these really good recommendations that they don't share. And yet when you ask them, hey, what do you recommend as your top recommendation, but also just what do you recommend right now? Like, what's good on COVID-19 vaccines, or what's good about the siege on the Capitol? Like, if it's people that you trust or at least find interesting consistently, and you're getting what they recommend, that's a totally different universe. And I noticed, with the siege on the Capitol thing, there was something on Thoughtful that I thought was really good. And most of the stuff I saw, I just couldn't even try it on Twitter because I just knew it was going to be so partisan, so agenda driven. So it's really this, I think of it as, it's this magic place where you're pulling in all the best stuff that you know about, and then all the best stuff from people that you find thoughtful and that they know about. And so it just ends up being, you just come to this place and it's really, you really stop. I mean, at least, us and the more active thoughtful users, it's really, you think like, how could I ever just have spent all that time scrolling through all that stuff and going down these rabbit holes, when I can go on Thoughtful and on any given day, it'll be something that is either, hey, that was really interesting and valuable, or even, hey, I got some idea that's going to change the trajectory of my year.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and two other things that just come to mind as you're talking about this that were critical insights for the way we've framed and built the product. I mean, the first is that everything, the atomic unit on thoughtful is a recommendation. And it's easy to gloss over what exactly that means, but it has profound effects on the general orientation you have when you're using the product. So what you can't do on thoughtful is go share something and criticize it. You what you can't do is say, oh, this is, look at this terrible article. The fundamental unit on thoughtful is something that you think is either good or great. It's a profoundly positive place as a result of that, and it ends up being um, that's just a totally different experience where the emphasis and the whole structure of the product is built to get these positive recommendations, whether they're things that you just get a lot out of, or in the extreme case, what we call top recommendations. They're things that could even be perspective changing or perspective forming for you to get these recommendations out of people's head, because that is often, that's the gold out on the internet. That's our mechanism for finding it, is that we have this incredible emphasis on what do people actually recommend, not just give us your best critique of why this article from the New York Times is wrong in 12 ways. So that's one piece. The second is that one of the experiences that I sort of really struggled with prior to having thoughtful is these apps like podcast apps like YouTube. They what they do is essentially segregate content by its content type. So you've got all your videos together, and YouTube has a watch later list in YouTube, and you've got your podcast and your audio content sort of off in the corner there in a podcast app. And the fundamental shift that we've done in thoughtful is we've said, the thing that's going to unify the content here isn't going to be the type. It's going to be the fact that it's actually thoughtful, the fact that it's actually enriching, the fact that it's going to be a good use of your time. And the reason we went in that direction is that it makes it possible for you to develop an expectation that every time you open this app, whether you want to read something, watch something, listen to something, whether you've got 5 minutes or an hour, every time you open this app, you're going to get something that's good for you, something that's interesting, stimulating, and enriching. And that's how you build a habit of actually consuming the stuff that you mean to get to but rarely do, is that you make it that easy. You put it all in one place. You make it work across lots of different contexts, and you don't make people develop the habit of, oh, is this the right time to go to podcast, or is this the time to go look at YouTube? This is why people end up opening Twitter and Facebook, because they're catch-alls. You've got 5 minutes, you're going to get something interesting there. And so we're keying off of, we want to build that same sort of psychological relationship with a much more positive content source that is just as reliable and giving you something that's going to be amazing and interesting, but is actually good for you. And so that's sort of another just really big insight there. And then there's a whole lot we've done in the app itself, in the product itself, to make consuming the kind of content that is in fact enriching reasonable and exciting and easy to do in an app. And so, for example, with YouTube videos, a lot of the best YouTube videos are not going to be your 5-minute cat video. A lot of the stuff that's enriching and actually you're going to be proud of having consumed at the end of the day, these are going to be like 20, 30, 40, sometimes 2-hour long videos. They could be lectures, they could be interviews, it could be documentaries. It's hard to watch that stuff on YouTube. I mean, how often do you find yourself actually having the time to do it? But in Thoughtful, we make it super easy to do that. We're really good about keeping your place in long form content, about jumping right back to where you left off. And so when you see, it turns out when you actually have 5-10 minute increments of time, you can actually get through a lot of hour-long lectures, tons and tons of them. And so just that we've having the diligence in the product to really focus on how do you make it a great experience to consume long form content, even though the internet and the platforms we're used to they kind of make long form content pretty second class. And so we spent a lot of time on that. We care very deeply about that. And then you throw that together with the fact that this is a place where everything is enriching, where you can develop a habit of going there when you've got 5-10 minutes or an hour. And the fact that the content itself is just all framed in the positive. It's all about what's good, what you're going to enjoy, what you're going to get stuff out of. It's a pretty unique experience that we've got today. And again, it's super early, but the feedback we get from people these days is that it's something between very nice and maybe even life changing, which is it's a good place to start.
All right, we got to wrap up in a minute, but just one final connection that I thought of in connection with our earlier discussions just about the existing platforms in terms of the purposes. It's people always expect that there's going to be a lot of user interaction in Thoughtful and commenting and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's none. There's almost none. I mean, but and it's interesting because our whole purpose is to give you is to really facilitate your ability to just have more and more thoughtful content in your life. And so one of the key things is, how are we going to get you thoughtful content? Is it going to be what your friends think at the moment about something? Or is it going to be what thoughtful people recommend? And our view is that it's going to be what thoughtful people recommend. We think of it as, well, it's like gold in the ocean. The internet is like, there's whatever trillions of dollars worth of gold in the ocean, but it's also diluted by everything else. And that's like thoughtful content on the internet. So yeah, it's not about just this vague idea of a marketplace of ideas and everyone says what they want and that leads to something magical. It's really our goal, and that's not everyone's goal. But it's like, yeah, if you want really this endless supply of thoughtful content that you can really enjoy and benefit from and actually use, and to the exclusion of all these things that waste your life, that's everything is engineered around that. So let me give the web address again so that people can sign up. They can sign up at thoughtful.community/HFP. Now, I want to make clear, this is putting you on a list where we'll let you in at some point. The earlier you sign up, the better. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did last time, which is, if you want to email me at alex@alexepstein.com, if you particularly like the idea of Thoughtful, you think you'd be you think you'd benefit from it, you think you'd give us good feedback on it, then you can make a plea, and maybe even put plea in the subject, just to really prostrate
too
yourself.
much, Alex.
I'm just kidding. But just, like why I think I'd be a good Thoughtful user. So that, but yeah, thoughtful.community/HFP. All right, Brian, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to share a final thought before we wrap up.
I mean, I think I said it all already. It's been a lot of fun talking with you. I really look forward to learning from all the new folks who are going to sign up for Thoughtful.
All right. So I will spend the rest of Brian's 30 seconds by saying once again, thoughtful.community/HFP. And to do my usual wrap up, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Oh yeah, you can also discuss this on, ironically, Facebook at facebook.com/human-flourishing-project. All right, that is it for this week. Thanks again to Brian for joining me, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of the Human Flourishing Project.